Hi everyone, and welcome to the 22nd week of Ordinary Time. This is Father John, and the readings are interesting. First, we were talking about John 6 for so long, maybe we forgot that we're in year B and we're talking about the Gospel of Mark. And so we're back into the Gospel of Mark and following Jesus in his ministry. And well, I guess we'll start with the Old Testament first. In the Old Testament, it's this beautiful reading by Moses, and he's giving the people the commands, and he says, this is so people can say, like, what God is so close to their people as God is to the people of Israel. And so right away we see this truth that God gives his commandments to his people not to take away their party or to restrain them. Restraint in a certain sense, right? But God's commands, his laws, are for people's thriving, okay? It is so that he can be close to them. It is so that he can dwell with them. Because I've said a few times before, God is yearning to dwell with his people, all right? And so these commandments that he gave people are so that he can dwell with them. And that's what we get in the Old Testament. And then it's for evangelization too. All the other nations are going to say, wow, look at how close God is to his people. Who would have known that God could get so close to human beings, right? And so now God is literally dwelling with people, and that's where the gospel picks up today. Jesus Christ is God dwelling among men. And the Pharisees, who are the first ones who are supposed to be able to see this, kind of get into a tizzy because Jesus and his disciples didn't wash their hands, okay? And this is where we need to make the distinction between the commands that God gives us and man-made rules that can change over time, okay? First of all, Jesus is God. He's the one who is giving the commands in the Old Testament. We forget about this. We kind of fall into that. I've talked about this before. It's not funny. No heresy is funny. But it's kind of funny because we think, well, God the Father was in the Old Testament and he was really mean, and so he sent his son in the New Testament to do a PR job to kind of clean up, and now we live in the age of the Holy Spirit, and it's kind of this New Age spirit. That's not true at all. The Holy Trinity was always there. All three of them are there. They're one God, three persons, and they were there in the Old Testament. They're there in the time of Jesus, and they're here now. Okay, and so this is the same God giving commands for our thriving, all right? But now the Pharisees miss it, and they're just like, well, why didn't he wash his hands? Because obviously they're jealous, and Jesus is stealing the show, if you will, and it's his show, right? And the problem is that they're not doing their job, and so God himself has come to dwell among his people so as to draw them back to himself. All right, and what is Jesus's response to this, right? Because they're trying to get him. And just a little sidetrack is, you just got to be straight honest with someone. Instead of trying to get them on the little nitpickies, just what is the problem? Jesus is trying to get to that. Like, what is essentially going on here? It's like the commands, the rules, the laws by which man needs to abide by has to do with what's going on in the heart. Okay, because he says it's out, whatever goes in us, it doesn't matter, it just comes out, okay? But it's from within, from our heart, that's where real evil comes from, right? And he goes on a list, and I don't have it in front of me, but it's like, that's where there's theft, that's where there's murder, that's where we say all these terrible things that can destroy people. It's the human heart, okay? So you'll see at the Mass, I wash my hands, right? It's Lord, wash me of my iniquity, cleanse me of my sins. It's symbolic of the fact that I am washing my hands, and hopefully clean hands represent a pure heart, right? So that's important. We've made it a part of our tradition. But what's more important is the fact that represents this purity of heart that we're striving for in the Beatitudes. Blessed are the pure of heart, for they will see God. Okay? And again, it's not to make us feel terrible all the time and give us like this terrible guilt complex. What those commands are laws that will help us thrive. Because I think we've all experienced when we've got this bitterness and resentment in us, when we're attacking other people, where everything is everyone else's fault, we feel miserable inside once we're honest with ourselves, right? And so when we're encountering in today's gospel, Jesus is saying, look, there's those man-made traditions, and they can change. And then there's these essential commandments of God, this law that if we abide by, we will thrive by, because that's how we were made. Okay, so as we approach the table of the Lord today and we receive Jesus, let's ask for a purity of heart. because it's out of our hearts that some pretty bad things can happen. And those are the things that make us miserable. But God has formed us and given us the faith that has commands within it that can help us to thrive. Let us ask God to help us by his grace to learn how to thrive in this life so as to one day see him in heaven face to face.